Hi there, I'm Matthew Lester from the Rhodes Business School. Some of you might have known of me from tax lectures and things around the country. Recently I was asked to talk to the conference of the South African Bursars of Independent Schools, SABISA, down in Port Elizabeth. Now, I've done these talks for many years, primarily concentrating on the issue of affordability of independent schools, something I've got a bit of a hang-up about. Now this year, things changed a lot. The day before I gave the lecture, the St Andrews DSG campus in Grahamstown was invaded by Fees Must Fall protesters, and that gave me a thought. Let's talk about this all in the context of the Fees Must Fall crisis, because an inconvenient truth emerges. So, I work at Rhodes University, we've had our problems. Another part of my life is that I was appointed by Prof. Gordon to the Davis Tax Committee, where I've been making some efforts over the last couple of years. This has shown me more about my country than I ever knew, and a lot of statistics that we don't look at from behind high walls, and we need to have a look at them and say, is South Africa sustainable? If South Africa is not sustainable, then nothing here is sustainable, not even our independent schools. So, when I was a student, we had orderly protests. They've been a feature of student life for as long as they've been students. But we never believed that it would escalate to this. And where does that anger come from? What is it all about? We need to go and find out and dig more and say, is this more than just a bunch of rowdy students? Or is there more to the story? But all of this must be good news for the private schools. It must be good for private universities and e-learning, where mums and dads are saying, we'll have nothing to do with it, we won't expose our kids to this, they can go and do something else, even if they take a gap year, and some of our kids are just flunking out and saying, I'm not going to university because of the crisis, and doing something further. We need to take that into consideration as well. Sustainable leadership has four components. Economy, in the context of the independent schools, this is quite good news for business. On the ecology side, well, we can say we're being green and we're going to carbon neutral schools, etc. But we have to go further. We have to look at the equity and ethics. This is a big debate in all aspects of business today. And we've got to say, what's it all about? Well, when it comes to all business decisions today, we are putting up a spectrum. And we're saying we have always measured things on the efficiency spectrum. Is it profitable? Does it make good business sense? And today, more and more, when we talk sustainable leadership, we are talking about the social spectrum. Is it morally wrong or inequitable, or is it morally right and justifiable? And if you're clever with PowerPoint, you can mark these off and put it into one spectrum. And we can say the leadership of our past talked about efficiency only. Let's put some characters up there. But more and more today, we are talking about the social spectrum. This is emerging from books such as Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Pikkety. We saw Bernie Sanders make a big go of it in the run-up to the presidential elections in America. And we simply don't know where we are going to go with it in the Clinton administration if she gets there. That will be another question for another day. But Pikkety is going on about education. Piketty's work must be looked at in conjunction with other reports. Piketty's work is based on Alverda and Atkinson's findings in South Africa in 2007. We must also bring into this the university fees crisis in South Africa and the papers of Pikkety et al. Meanwhile, South Africa has been fighting over the Nkandla issue for the past 2,000 days. And during that time, at the current rate, we have had 6 million babies arrive in South Africa since the Nkandla debate has started. That's enough to fill the CALABASH stadium 60 times over. We're having a baby shower in South Africa. And when we look at what Parliament is concentrating on, it's all of this stuff. So, what's the baseline on it? The National Development Plan, on which we all work, is based on a projection that South Africa's population would level off. Far from it. We're already way ahead of the curve used in the National Development Plan, And by 2030, there will be 6 million more South Africans than we've budgeted for. We're already at 56 million. And when one looks at this, people say, oh, the grant system will just collapse our country. Rubbish, that's not going to happen. The grant system is very affordable in South Africa and is having an ever-diminishing effect on gross domestic product. But our problem in South Africa is those that don't receive grants, what we call the bulging middle. That's the age group 14 to 65. They get very little from the grant system unless they are totally disabled. And that is the problem which is basically underpinning the Fees Must Fall crisis. So if you turn 19 today, unless you are very privileged, your child grant stops, your education system isn't working, and youth employment is rampant. That situation is getting worse and worse. And we remember with great fondness the great days of Trevor Manuel telling us that our economy was working. But ever since the Manuel era, all that we have been doing is making an ongoing attempt to contain South Africa's debt trajectory, which got out of hand in 2011. So we're not really making much progress in that regard. Thomas Pikkety, with all his wisdom, doesn't have very much to say about this. He was out in South Africa last year, and he basically said, look, all my research is looking at Europe and America. There's a very important distinction, he says. Their populations are not growing. So if we take France, for example, at the end of the Second World War, there were about 45 million Frenchmen, and that number's around 70 million today. In South Africa, the population has grown from 6 million in 1945 to a staggering 56 million today. So we can't look for answers from Thomas Pikkety and his redistribution of wealth models. If we look at what Murray Leibbrandt is saying, he's saying the top 1% of South Africa had 20% of the income in 1948 at the dawn of apartheid. By 1994, that 1% had declined to owning 10% of the income. But today, we're back where we started in 1948 and going south fast. The equity position in South Africa is just unbelievable. Now, to try and sort this all out, Pikkety says education is more effective than any other stimulus package that you can get, even handouts, because of the multiplier effects that we get from successfully educating our people. And Mandela had that view as well. That's why his policies changed to go back to school. We have to use education in trying to solve our problems. It's the only weapon that we can all agree on. Now, going back to Mr. Pikkety, he produces this curve in America. He says, when you look at the lowest deciles, their chances of getting their children to university, or college as they call it in America, it's very, very limited. And he goes up the scale to the richest decile, where nearly all of their children go to university. So the rich get educated and get richer, and the poor don't catch up. Now, if one looks at that, we say, hey, solving this problem is easy. We create a model for direct intervention for the poor. In South Africa, that would be NSFAS. Then we have to have interventions for the missing middle. And the rich, well, sorry, they can pay for it. So the argument at the moment in South Africa is that if you can afford an independent school, you can certainly afford a university education for your children. Well, we've got to examine that and go into it in more detail. And we have to take into that also some other papers, particularly Alvarado and Atkinson, which look at wealth distribution in South Africa. Now, this was done in 2007, where they looked at the top 10% of income earners. And they said, would you believe it, that in 2007, the top 10% decile starts when you earn more than 80,000 Rand a year. And then the top 1%, well, that would be where you're earning more than 400,000 Rand a year. Now, that was in 2007. And if we take that forward and we use star stats and all the rest of it, we can predict it today that the top decile is earning around about 140,000 Rand a year, and your top decile, 1%, are earning more than 600,000 Rand a year. So now we go over to the work of Pikkety et al. And they have found that in this debate, one has to look at who are this bunch that can't get to university. They're marked in red on the deciles in South Africa. And it shows that in the poorest deciles of South Africa, you haven't really got a chance of getting to university. Not because you can't afford it, but simply your basic education is at such a low level that you don't qualify to go to university. And that extends all the way up to decile 9. Now, those who can't get to university because of perhaps fee issues are marked in red. Those who are at university are marked in green. And when one looks at this, one sees that there is an enormous inequality in South African university education because a large component of them are in the top decile. And we can't really compare this to the works of Pikkety because a financial intervention for the poorest of the poor extends all the way from decile 1 all the way through to decile 9 about. And only the most privileged are getting there, irrespective of NSFAS. Now, we also have to say this problem extends far beyond our universities. So when we look at it in the populations 5 to 24 that are getting educated, only 5% of that population are attending university. The rest are at schools. Their numbers are just staggering. And those schools are not producing the results that get South Africans educated. We need to do something about that as well. So when we come to the fees must fall crisis, what we see is that as the student numbers increased, the amounts of subsidy received by universities weren't enough. So they had to put up their fees. So we got above inflation increases in fees all the way through the last 6 or 7 years, culminating in 2015, where the students said, we've had enough. That is where the fees must fall crisis comes from. And so, again, the increase in universities' fees stopped in 2015. But what we've got to do to try and sort this out is a staggering challenge. Let's take this back to what Pikkety's saying. He's saying, well, we need direct financial intervention for the poorest of the poor. But if we're looking at it in the South African context, that extends all the way up to the top decile. So in order to get some sort of meaningful difference in this, the financial package of intervention for the universities has got to extend not for the first 1 or 2 deciles, but nearly all the way across the board. That's a staggering challenge, and it's very different to other countries around the world. If one looks at what we've got in state expenditure allocated to universities, then the results are pretty pitiful. Yes, we do spend more on education than anything else in South Africa, but let's see how it works. We have the grants to basic education, 228 billion rand. That is 16% of the national budget. But then we've got to keep everybody else happy. Health, defence, economic affairs, local development, the general public services, social protection. Then we've got to pay the ever-increasing interest bill on South Africa. And finally, we get to the post-school education budget. That is only 68 billion rand of the total spend of almost 1.3 trillion rand. Now, in the medium-term budget framework speech, they're saying, what do you mean we're spending more than 1% of GDP on education? No, because when you blow out the post-school education budget, we find, hey, hang on, we spend a whole lot of that budget on vocational training, skills development and CETAs, and we know those systems don't really work, before we even get to the universities and the National Financial Aid Scheme and the university subsidies. Finally, we get on to building more universities for the future, and that's another story. Now, what we are saying is that government is pushing all their money towards the NSFAS scheme. That is a direct financial aid package, rather than going the use of general university subsidies. Why? Because in the NSFAS scheme, you are giving a direct and targeted intervention to the poor, whereas when one goes university subsidies, well, that's just based on headcount in universities, and so we are subsidizing the rich to some extent, and that's what the economists call regressive. So we've got to say, well, that's got to change. But the problem then becomes the NSFAS schemes, which the students are totally sick of. They are saying, look, you can try and fix it whichever way you want, but as some of the students say, that's like putting lipstick on a pig. So we take that and we say government is trying to put more and more money towards this. And in fact, in 2015, they announced a 3-year program to put 16 billion rand more to the universities, and that is primarily going to the NSFAS scheme. But it's not working. Because when one looks at what is happening in our universities and our throughput rates, we have the staggering reality that there is strong evidence of a regressive proportions of black people being able to complete their degrees. And this is where some of the anger is coming from, is that although you might have a NSFAS funding opportunity, that doesn't mean that you're going to get there to a degree at the end of the day, and the whole thing might land up as being a massive disappointment. It is amazing to me that we've been at this for 22 years in the new South Africa, and that trend still exists. It's quite frightening. So we take all of this forward and we say, right, in the future, we have got to have an education system that encompasses the input of students, universities, the private sector, and government. Unless we can get all 4 of those to work together, well, then we don't have a model. And that is what is missing in the current crisis. That's what we're trying to work on. So now what we're going to say is we have got a national crisis. It doesn't only affect universities. It affects everybody. If a small minority of students can bring total university disruption as they have in recent weeks, can you imagine if this thing extends? It doesn't matter where you're in education then, it's going to have a major impact. The private sector has to create a massive education initiative to support public schools and universities. That's simply not coping, and we need the involvement of the private sector in what we are doing. So let's have a look at the demographics of South Africa as to why. And here is a study conducted by National Treasury, which is looking at our population growth rates, which I referred to earlier. And it says, let's look into the future. Now, looking into the future is something not a lot of people want to do. If you talk to farmers in the Eastern Cape, they say, ek kyk ver, maar ek sien fok al. Okay, what we are saying is, look into the future. The further you look into the future, the more certain things become. So, in 50 years' time, I know with almost 100% certainty, I'll be dead. And that will be a relief to you if you're watching this video. Similarly, we can say, if the population keeps growing at this rate, we will have to create 9 million new jobs in South Africa in the next 50 years, or we are going to face social chaos. And I think that that is a message that all South Africans have to know. Unless we can create the 9 million new jobs, then South Africa is not sustainable. If South Africa is not sustainable, we mustn't only look at that in terms of being green and carbon emissions and things, not that they're not important. We've also got to look at people before planet. And we've got to say, those people sitting there are not going to tolerate this for another 50 years. And this is why it is a challenge for all South Africans to get involved in this problem. So at the Rhodes Business School, we've been thinking about this. We think that if we are to lead up to our idea of leadership for sustainability, then we should be running an initiative in this regard. And we've looked at it, and we've looked at the independent schools, and we've seen some wonderful projects that they are doing for the poor and how they're getting involved in it. What we're wanting to say is we want to make that bigger, a hell of a lot bigger. We want to roll it out nationally, and this is our idea. We want a free support program for all students of South Africa that is coming from the private sector. We are wanting to use the one vehicle that we have for making people aware of this, and that is social media. The one thing apart from the population where one sees enormous growth is literally in the devices that everybody carries today. Those devices are growing faster than the population. And we are wanting to use the internet in a special way to create supplementary training programs that can be downloaded through late night owl rates or other deals done with the service providers in a way that we can get this stuff onto the phones of everybody to help them, onto any device. And we've devised some ways of doing it. But what we need to do is to create the supplementary material to get teachers and lecturers and professionals to come along and say, you are a top young teacher or professional. We are wanting you to help us make supplementary video material to supplement what they are getting in the classroom of all South African schools. And then we are saying we're wanting the independent schools to help share this information with the whole of South Africa. We've got to make that accessible. Now, how are we going to do that? Am I going to come along and say, hey, teachers, I'm going to pay you for this material? No. This is a national project. Nobody's getting paid for it. But I'll do a fair exchange. How about if you come and teach for me at the Rhodes Business School, I will get you through an MBA designed specifically for education over a period of 3.5 years. It works like this. We will find a principal sponsor, we think we've got one, and we will set up a foundation. I'm going to call that the Past, Present, Future Foundation, one word, because we are addressing things of the past. The present, well, that was already the past. And the future is the challenge to find the 9 million jobs. And we were going to say through the Rhodes Business School, we are going to raise the money to put people on a professional MBA program for free if they teach for free. And we say, instructors, come along. We'll help you attain your goals of getting a very high level qualification that is urgently needed in the educational sector. It will be your pathway to getting towards a headmastership, we hope. And in return, you will use your teaching skills, which we will help you distribute on a national basis. So what we're saying is that during the school holidays for a couple of years, students and teachers will come to university for a week at a time and do teaching blocks on an MBA program twice a year during the school holidays. That will extend over a 3-year period to complete the components of an MBA program. And then in the 4th year, you will do your mini dissertation. We've got the time to do that. There's lots of time to get a degree. You've got 40 years of your life left. So come and study with us and help us create the educational material that we are needing in basic education. So we're wanting to put a new dynamic on this initiative. Students throughout South Africa will get additional free resources from the best instructors that South Africa have to offer. The principal sponsor and advertisers will get massive new brand royalty by getting involved in a program where they are distributing the educational content that South Africa needs. They are participating in solving the fees must fall crisis, and we'll also find a way of making it much more effective in the data must fall crisis. Instructors will get recognition as a top instructor as being selected on this program, and at the end of the 3.5-year period, they'll get an internationally accredited MBA to use in their career going forward. And our business school will grow as we're intending it to do. Now, I think Thomas Pikkety would have liked that. What this lecture is trying to show is that the fees must fall crisis is not just a problem at the universities. It's right at the doorstep of every independent school in South Africa. And it's not a problem that the universities are going to be able to solve on its own, even if government comes up with the money. There are far more aspects to transformation of tertiary education than just the fees must fall crisis. What we are looking for is to create a partnership with the independent schools of South Africa to say, we have a problem with the sustainability of South Africa and inherently the sustainability of the independent schools. Come and get involved with us and see what we can do. I think Mr. Pikkety would like that. Thank you for your attention.